Here you have a horrific fire in which 3 children die, and then you have a man who's accused of setting that fire. And he's finally executed, the father of these 3 children, in 2004.
What if a man was executed for a crime that never happened? Most death row inmates fight for their lives. They file appeal after appeal, hoping for a last-minute stay of execution. Some confess, hoping for forgiveness. Some go to their death with acceptance. But Cameron Todd Willingham, he died claiming innocence. For 12 years, Willingham claimed that he did not set the fire. In his final hours, his lawyers desperately fought to present new evidence, but they were unable to stop the execution. What if the fire was truly an accident? What if he was executed for a crime that never even happened? This is the story of Cameron Todd Willingham's final 24 hours, and a case that still haunts the criminal justice system to this day.
Hearst had come to believe Todd Willingham was not guilty.
Todd Willingham's case falls into that category where there is not one iota of evidence that the fire was arson.
Cameron Todd Willingham was born on January 9, 1968 in Texas. His early life was far from stable. By the late 1980s, he had built a criminal record that included grand larceny, shoplifting, and substance abuse issues. In 1987, he was arrested for stealing and sentenced to 60 days in jail, followed by 2 years of probation. A year later, he was arrested again for driving under the influence of inhalants and sentenced to probation under the condition that he complete a rehabilitation program. His act continued in 1989 when he was caught shoplifting. As a result, his previous probations were revoked and he was sent to a boot camp-style correctional program. Despite these troubles, Willingham later settled in Corsicana, Texas, where he lived with his wife, Stacy Kuykendall, and their 3 daughters, Amber, Carmen, and Cameron. On December 23, 1991, tragedy struck. A fire engulfed the Willingham family's home, killing all 3 of his daughters. Willingham, who had been home at the time, escaped with only minor injuries, while his wife had been out Christmas shopping. In January 1992, Willingham was arrested and charged with capital murder. After the fire, the police investigation revealed that the fire had been deliberately started using a liquid accelerant. Evidence included burn marks on the floor forming puddles, multiple starting points for the fire, and signs that the fire had burned fast and hot, which all pointed to the use of an accelerant. The investigators also discovered charring under the aluminum front door frame, suggesting the presence of a liquid accelerant, and tests confirmed traces of an accelerant near the front door. Despite this, no clear motive for the fire was found, and Willingham's wife denied that they had argued before the fire occurred. Along with the arson evidence, a jailhouse informant named Johnny Webb testified. His testimony became controversial for several reasons. Webb claimed that Willingham confessed to starting the fire to cover up an injury or death of one of the children, allegedly caused by his wife. However, no physical injuries were found on the children after the fire. Webb later told journalist David Gran that he might have been mistaken, as he had been prescribed medication for bipolar disorder at the time. Webb also explained the distinguishable burns found on Amber's forehead and arm, suggesting Willingham had burned her to make it look like the children were playing with fire. At trial, prosecutor John Jackson noted that Webb was an unreliable witness, though he later supported Webb's early release from prison. Webb later tried to retract his testimony, sending a motion to recant that declared Willingham was innocent. He also questioned whether the statute of limitations had expired for perjury. In February 2014, the New York Times reported that the Innocence Project found a handwritten note suggesting a deal had been made with Webb to reduce his sentence for his testimony. During the penalty phase of the trial, prosecutor Jackson suggested that Willingham's tattoo of a skull and serpent fit the profile of a sociopath. 2 medical experts agreed. One expert, a psychologist without a background in sociopathy, argued that Willingham's Iron Maiden poster symbolized violence and death. The other, psychiatrist James Grigson, known as Dr. Death, claimed Willingham was an extremely severe sociopath, with no hope of rehabilitation. Grigson had been discredited for unethical conduct before his death. The prosecution also tried to portray Willingham's behavior during and after the fire as suspicious. After the fire started, Willingham was seen at the front door, shouting for help and claiming that his children were inside. His behavior during this time seemed a mix of calm and hysteria, though he later explained he was moving his car to avoid it exploding and worsening the fire. Eyewitnesses described Willingham as having singed hair and burns on his chest and shoulder, but noted that there was no evidence of smoke inhalation. His wrists and hands were covered in soot. He was taken to the hospital in handcuffs. Neighbors, including Brandeis and Diane Barbie, claimed that Willingham refused to re-enter the house to save his children. Willingham moved his car away from the fire and then sat calmly on a nearby lawn without attempting to rescue his children. After the fire, he seemed more agitated, even being restrained by emergency personnel. Willingham returned to the scene in the days following the fire, where he appeared oddly calm at first, but became somber when authorities arrived. He also expressed frustration over the loss of a dart set, even ordering a replacement at a bar, saying money was no longer an issue. The prosecution argued that Willingham may have wanted to get rid of his children. They suggested the fire was the third attempt to kill them, claiming that he had tried to cause miscarriages by kicking his wife during her pregnancies. However, journalist David Gran reported that there was no police or medical evidence supporting this. Willingham's wife denied that he had physically abused the children. The prosecution also painted him as a serial wife abuser and sociopath. On the other hand, those who knew Willingham personally, like his probation officer Polly Gooden, described him as a good person, and former Judge B.B. Bridges doubted he could have killed his children, describing him as polite and caring. Willingham was charged with murder on January 8, 1992. During his trial in August 1992, he was offered a life sentence in exchange for a guilty plea but refused, insisting on his innocence. Fire investigator Vasquez testified that there were 3 points of origin for the fire, suggesting it had been intentionally set. A sample near the door tested positive for lighter fluid, and it was noted that Willingham had escaped the fire with no burn marks, further supporting the claim that he poured the accelerant on his way out. Several witnesses testified against him. For 12 long years, Cameron Todd Willingham waited for the inevitable. Locked away in a 6-by-10-foot cell in the Polunsky unit in Texas, he woke up each morning to the same unchanging routine. Cold cement walls, the sound of distant voices echoing through the prison, the knowledge that his life could be taken at any moment. Day after day, year after year, he watched other death row inmates walk the final path before him, knowing that his time would come soon enough. Time moves differently on death row. Some men count the days, others stop counting altogether. Willingham had plenty of time to think about his past, about his mistakes, about the moment his life had stopped in its tracks back in 1992. He was 36 years old, a young man, full of fight, still believing there was hope for something beyond these prison walls. But hope fades when you spend over a decade in a cell, with the world moving forward while you remain frozen in place. Outside, his wife remarried, his friends moved on, and the small Texas town where it all began barely spoke his name anymore. Inside, the countdown never stopped. Every few months, another inmate was taken away. Willingham saw it happen countless times, guards arriving, calling a name, escorting a man down the hall. Some went quietly, others fought until the last second. Some made final statements, while others refused to speak at all. Willingham had no escape but his own thoughts. Did he replay the last moments with his daughters? Or did he focus on what was coming? The date was set. It was February 17, 2004. Cameron Todd Willingham had just 24 hours left to live. The final 24 hours. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the prison was still dark, when the guards arrived at Cameron Todd Willingham's cell. The air was heavy with the weight of the day ahead. Today wasn't like the thousands of other mornings he had lived on Texas's death row. This was the last one. There was no future beyond the next 15 hours. No appeals left. No delays. No more waiting. Was he afraid? Or had he made peace with what was coming? The guards watched him closely. Inmates on death watch were monitored around the clock. Every move noted, every moment recorded. Some prisoners spent their last day in panic and desperation. Some broke down, some prayed. Willingham remained calm. For years, he had refused to confess to the crime he had been convicted of. He had spent more than a decade insisting he was innocent. But innocence wouldn't matter today. Today, Texas was going to execute him. Beyond the walls of Huntsville's Walls unit, the world outside continued as normal. The sun was rising, people were heading to work, life was moving forward. Willingham was given his morning meal, but like many inmates facing execution, he barely touched it. His breakfast was the same as any other prisoner's, a meal he had eaten countless times before. Nothing special. Most prisoners spend their final day surrounded by family, friends, or spiritual advisors. Even the worst criminals are often granted final visits, one last moment to say goodbye. But no one came for Cameron Todd Willingham. His parents had already passed away. His ex-wife had long since cut ties with him. Their marriage had been filled with fights and allegations of abuse, and she had stood by his conviction, believing that he had killed their children. If Willingham was holding on to any hope for a last-minute call from the governor, he would have been disappointed. At 8 o'clock in the morning, guards informed him one last time that he could request a visit from a chaplain or a prison official if he wished. He declined. He had no interest in seeking redemption for something he swore he didn't do. Outside the prison walls, his attorneys were still fighting. At this very moment, his defense team was making a final push to stop the execution. They had uncovered a damning new report. It was an analysis by fire expert Dr. Gerald Hurst, which stated that the fire in Willingham's home had not been arson. Dr. Hurst dismantled every piece of forensic evidence that had been used to convict Willingham. The original fire investigators had relied on outdated, unscientific methods. They had mistaken common burn patterns for signs of arson. But the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles ignored the report. The governor, Rick Perry, refused to intervene. Inside his cell, Willingham may not have known the exact details of the legal battle playing out on his behalf. But he had been in this fight long enough to know one thing. It was over. There would be no last-minute miracle. Death row is never truly silent. The walls echo with distant voices of prisoners, some yelling, some praying, some talking to themselves. By 11 o'clock, the execution was no longer just a scheduled event on the prison calendar. It had become a public spectacle. Outside the Walls Unit prison, the scene was growing tense. Protesters stood with signs, demanding that Texas stop the execution. Reporters were setting up cameras, preparing for the moment when they could announce to the world that Cameron Todd Willingham is dead. By noon, Cameron Todd Willingham was entering the final stretch of his life. Just 9 hours remained before he was scheduled to be executed. It was tradition for death row inmates to receive a final meal of their choosing, often something special or nostalgic. Some men requested extravagant meals, steak, lobster, desserts, while others asked for simple comfort foods from childhood. Willingham? He refused. He picked at the prison food, chewing slowly, tasting nothing. The minutes stretched on, turning into an hour. He had nothing to do but wait. By late afternoon, the weight of what was happening spread beyond Texas. News stations across the country were covering the case. The Innocence Project had released a statement, arguing that Texas was about to execute a man based on junk science. At 4 o'clock in the evening, the prison staff began the final preparations for the execution. Willingham was informed that he would soon be taken to the execution chamber. Guards began assembling the necessary equipment for the lethal injection, which would end his life. The final check of his medical records and identification was completed, and the prison's execution team ensured everything was ready. The looming hour was one of mechanical routines for the prison staff, but for Willingham, it was a moment of reckoning. At 5 o'clock in the evening, Willingham was escorted toward the execution chamber. The weight of the moment had settled in, but he showed no outward signs of fear or regret. His steps were steady and his expression remained unchanged, as if he had long ago made peace with the end. The execution. At precisely 6:13 p.m., the lethal injection began to flow into Cameron Todd Willingham's veins. The execution, which had been a long time coming, was carried out in the sterile clinical atmosphere of the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville. The lethal dose of chemicals was administered with a sense of finality, marking the end of a journey that began with a tragic fire. It would only take about 7 minutes for Willingham's life to slip away, but for those in the execution chamber, the moment seemed to stretch on. Throughout the procedure, Willingham remained relatively still. Unlike many others who had gone before him, there were no dramatic convulsions or gasps for air. Witnesses observed that Willingham did not show signs of immediate distress. His eyes were closed, and his face held no apparent expression. Some speculated that the way he behaved reflected the mental state he had maintained throughout his time on death row. Quiet, stoic, and steadfast in his belief in his innocence. Despite the relatively smooth process, witnesses later stated that the execution appeared to take slightly longer than anticipated. The wait was drawn out, as if the act of taking a life could not be done without some hesitation, even by those tasked with carrying out the punishment. And Willingham was pronounced dead at 6:20 p.m. His body was swiftly removed from the chamber. The Texas State Penitentiary had performed the grim task, and the man who had spent nearly 12 years on death row was now gone. Willingham's execution was one of the final chapters in a long, painful story of alleged injustice. Rather than a public burial, Willingham's body was cremated. His ashes, however, would not be scattered in any public ceremony. In a private and symbolic act, his remains were scattered on the graves of his children at Oakwood Cemetery in Corsicana, Texas. For a man whose innocence had been fiercely contested until the end, the act of returning his ashes to his children's resting place added a layer of sorrow and complexity to the tragedy. The aftermath.
In Texas tonight, explosive new charges over the execution of a man who at least half a dozen forensic experts now believe was innocent. These new charges are again being leveled against Governor Rick.
The aftermath. The execution of Cameron Todd Willingham sparked a nationwide debate that centered around several key issues, including his innocence, the fairness of his trial, and the reliability of forensic science in criminal justice. Many were disturbed by the speed at which Willingham's case had moved through the system, especially considering the uncertainty surrounding the evidence that led to his conviction. Some felt that the state of Texas had executed a man who, in the eyes of many, was likely innocent. Others, however, were firm in their belief that justice had been served. For those who believed Willingham was wrongfully convicted, his execution became a symbol of the flaws within the criminal justice system, particularly the use of forensic evidence in criminal trials. The questions raised by his case prompted discussions on how such convictions, based on dubious or outdated science, could lead to irreversible consequences. These debates fueled the broader movement for criminal justice reform, especially in the context of death penalty cases. The public's reaction was divided, but the case made a lasting impression on how forensic evidence and the death penalty are viewed by both the public and legal experts. The case gained substantial media attention, especially when investigative journalists began examining the flaws in the original investigation. In 2004, reporters Maurice Postley and Steve Mills of the Chicago Tribune published a series of articles that revealed critical details about the poor investigative practices used in Willingham's case. These articles highlighted how the fire that killed his children had been hastily classified as arson, despite the lack of concrete evidence supporting such a claim. The reporters uncovered how fire science at the time was not as advanced as it is today, and how investigators relied on outdated and unreliable methods to determine the cause of the blaze. Their findings shed light on the possibility that Willingham's conviction was based on a flawed understanding of fire behavior. The media coverage surrounding the case reignited the debate over the death penalty and whether the justice system had properly handled Willingham's case. It also called into question the competence of the investigators who had worked on the case, sparking outrage among those who believed Willingham had been denied a fair trial. Further investigations into the case came to light in 2009, when journalist David Gran published an in-depth report. Gran's findings were disturbing, as they suggested that the evidence used to convict Willingham of arson was not just flawed, but fundamentally incorrect. He drew on the expertise of fire science specialists, who noted that advances in arson investigation since Willingham's trial had revealed that the evidence against him was inconsistent with the way fires spread and behaved. New scientific research indicated that the fire in question may have been accidental, not intentional. In 2011, the case gained even more attention with the release of the documentary Incendiary, The Willingham Case, which further explored the possibility that Willingham was wrongfully convicted. The film included expert testimony and detailed accounts of how modern fire science could have exonerated Willingham had it been available during his trial. The documentary was a turning point in raising awareness about the flaws in the justice system and the potential for wrongful convictions, particularly in cases where forensic evidence plays a central role. What do you think? Was justice served, or was an innocent man wrongfully convicted? We'd love to hear from you. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on future investigations into cases that have shaped history and still leave us questioning. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Stay curious and keep seeking the truth.